Okay. Roxy Ohanyan is our red-cockaded woodpecker biologist specialist. She works with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and she's been pursuing a career in ornithology since 2013. She's traveled all over the U.S. and beyond. She's worked with a number of imperiled and endangered species, including, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce this. I'll let you do that then, Roxy, later on. In Hawaii, scarlet macaws in Mexico, puffins in Maine, and Florida scrub jays in Florida. She received her MS in Fisheries and Wildlife Science from Arkansas Tech University, where she studied the winter ecology of rusty blackbirds. In addition to studying birds for work, she enjoys chasing and photographing birds in her free time. And the red-cockaded woodpecker is one of the most recognizable and iconic birds of the southeastern U.S. Once common throughout that area, their population has declined drastically due to habitat loss and human encroachment. Decades of intensive monitoring and management have helped boost their numbers and increase awareness for this unique and charismatic species. During her presentation, Roxy will discuss the natural history, monitoring, and management efforts for this bird, and she'll talk about the work she does with the woodpeckers in Central Florida. Let me admit a few more people here. There we go. Okay, Roxy, if you'd like to start.
Sure. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Share my presentation. You could just let me know if you all can see that.
Oh, that looks good. I forgot to mention too, if anybody has any questions, could you put them in the chat? And then Roxy and I will go through them at the end of the presentation. Thanks.
All righty. Well, thank you, Sue, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Sue said, my name is Roxy. I'm a red-cockaded woodpecker biologist working in Central Florida, and I'm very excited to talk about my study species, one of my favorite species. I titled this presentation Icon of the Southeast. This is not an official title, but I personally think that the species is iconic for a number of reasons. They have very unique biology. They're also just readily recognized in this area by a lot of people, even people who aren't birders. And they're also very important ecologically. So my goal with this talk is to familiarize you guys with the species if you're not already familiar, and to try and illustrate why I think the species is so iconic. And so I'm going to try to keep the talk to about 45, 50 minutes. There's a lot to talk about with these guys, so we'll see how it goes. All right, let's see. There we go. So in terms of physical description, for those of you who are not familiar with the species, the red-cockaded woodpecker is roughly the size of a hairy woodpecker, maybe a little bit smaller. They're readily identified by that large white cheek patch and also by the barring down the back. So the name red-cockaded woodpecker comes from this little red patch that the males have in between the cheek patch and the crown. And the word cockade actually refers to a feather or a ribbon that was worn in the hat hundreds of years ago as a symbol of status or rank. But honestly, the name red-cockaded woodpecker is not really the best name for them, because much like the ruby crown of the ruby crown kinglet or the ring neck of the ringneck duck, it's something that's not really easy to see in the field unless you're looking at the bird very close up, or unless the bird is agitated and the feathers are raised. So you can see it in these photos, but I took these with a 400mm lens at very close range. So realistically, if you're just walking around with your binoculars, you're probably not going to see the red cockade, but you can still identify them pretty easily by the cheek patch and by the barring down the back, and also by their vocalizations. So probably the most interesting aspect of their biology is that they are a cooperative breeder. So that means in a healthy, robust population, these birds generally live in family groups consisting of a breeding male, a breeding female, helpers, and then in the fall, any fledglings they might have. So the helpers are non-breeding adults, usually related to one or both of the breeding adults. Very often they'll be young from previous years. Sometimes unrelated adults will join a family group as a helper, but usually it's going to be birds that are related to the breeding pair. And as the name suggests, the helpers are going to assist the breeding pair with incubating eggs, feeding chicks in the nest, feeding fledglings, protecting the nest, and also defending the territory. So generally, we do expect breeding pairs that have helpers to have better reproductive success than those that don't have helpers. Now, the helpers can be either male or female, but usually they are male, and this is related to their post-fledgling behavior. So after the birds fledge, they'll stay with their parents for a few months. They'll be dependent on their parents for feeding. But once they are no longer dependent on their parents, they will either disperse and go off and try to find a mate and start their own family group, or they will stay with their family group and help raise the next generation of young. So the female fledglings are more likely to disperse in their first year, whereas the male fledglings will kind of do either or. Some of them will disperse, some of them will stay with the family group. So that's why generally we tend to see a higher frequency of male helpers. And those helpers that do stay with the family group for 1 or more years, eventually they too will either disperse, or if one of the breeding adults dies and that breeding vacancy opens up, the helper will take over as the breeding adult of the group. So pretty interesting social structure that they have. Another interesting aspect of their biology is that they are the only woodpecker species in North America that exclusively excavates cavities in live pine trees. So other woodpecker species will use dead trees, snags, they'll also use hardwoods, but RCWs will exclusively make cavities in live pine trees. And this is because live pine trees produce sap, and the RCWs need that sap to protect their cavities from predators. So as you can see in this photo here, they've pecked out these sap wells all around the cavity. Sometimes they'll do it all around the tree. So that sap will flow down, make a nice sticky barrier all around the cavity and protect it from predators, particularly snakes. And this is especially important for the nest cavity because snakes are the primary predators of the RCW nests. So very often the nest cavity will be, or the nest tree will be the sappiest of all the trees in the territory. So this is another photo showing a sappy RCW tree. So when we are trying to find new RCW trees, this is sort of the search image that we have. This is what we look for. We try to see, you know, that sap flowing down almost like candle wax down the tree. We look for those sap wells, and that helps us identify those trees from a distance. Sometimes you can spot them a mile away. So in terms of habitat requirements, RCWs are pretty particular. So for the trees in which they make their cavities, they need mature pine and ideally old growth pine. And the species that they prefer is longleaf. And that's what's pictured here. And sometimes they will use other species. They'll use loblolly, they'll use slash pine, pond pine, shortleaf, but longleaf is their favorite. And there's 2 reasons for that. The first is that longleaf is the sappiest of the pines that we have here. So again, they do need that sap to protect their cavities from predators. The other reason is that longleaf pine is susceptible to a fungus that affects the heartwood of the tree. So that's the core of the tree where the RCWs are going to make their cavity. And this fungus, sometimes it's called heartwood rot fungus or red heart fungus, but basically it softens the heartwood of the tree and makes it easier for the woodpeckers to excavate a cavity. So the longleaf is more susceptible to the fungus and the older trees are more susceptible. So those really old longleaf pines are going to be the ideal type of tree for the woodpeckers to make their cavities. But they also need mature trees so that the tree is big enough to contain that cavity as well. So depending on the species, the trees that they use will be at least 60 to 80 years old, but ideally even older than that. And in terms of habitat, once again, the RCWs are quite particular. They do like a very nice open habitat, few or no hardwoods in the mid-story, very nice open understory, and then a ground cover that has a lot of native grasses and plants. So specifically here in Central Florida, you're going to see a lot of palmettos in that ground cover. So one of the most important aspects of their biology from a management perspective is that they are a fire-dependent species. Their habitat is fire maintained. So just to provide a little bit of background on this, in North America, we have a number of habitats and ecosystems that are fire maintained. So historically, these areas would have natural fires that would go through them. These fires would be started by lightning strikes. And so the fires would burn at some interval, and the fires would help maintain that habitat in a particular condition that would make it suitable for a particular suite of species. Now, the frequency of those fires, the intensity, that's going to depend on the habitat, and it's also going to depend on different environmental conditions, on altitude, latitude, all sorts of things. But the common denominator is that the fire is necessary for maintaining that habitat in a particular condition. So unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go into all the complexities of fire on the landscape. honestly, you could have a 10-hour talk just on that. There's so much that happens. But the important thing to remember is that fire is both a physical and a chemical process. So it alters the landscape in a very unique way that's impossible to replicate through mechanical means. So having that fire on the landscape is critical for maintaining the habitat. And in the case of the RCWs, the fire is needed to maintain that open understory, to keep those hardwoods out of the midstory, and to maintain that ground cover of native fire-adapted plants. So the bottom line is, in order to have good habitat, you need fire. And so in order to have RCWs, you need fire. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about their distribution as well. So as the title of my talk suggests, they are native to the southeastern United States. So this map here shows the historic range of the RCW, that's the blue shaded area, and then the current range, which is the red stars. So this map is a little bit old, but it does give you an idea of the range retractions that they've experienced, particularly in the north part of their range and in the west part of their range. So this is a slightly more updated map that shows you most of the current RCW populations. So again, as you can see, comparing that historic distribution to the current one, we're really seeing an extreme reduction in that distribution. So in terms of numbers, it's estimated that historically they had anywhere from 1 to 1.6 million family groups across the Southeast. But by the mid-1900s, that number dropped to about 1,470 family groups, just sort of scattered all over the place. So not even one contiguous population. So basically, they lost over 99% of their population since the time of European settlement. So, I mean, they nearly went extinct, basically, just a huge, huge population loss. Now, unsurprisingly, the main culprit for that loss was the loss of habitat, specifically the old growth longleaf pine ecosystem in the southeastern United States. So this map shows the historic and current distribution of longleaf pine. So the historic range is going to be in this shaded area here with the lines through it. And then the current distribution is these counties that are shaded in tan and orange. So you can see that a lot of those counties that still have longleaf have fewer than 30,000 acres. So overall, 97% of that old growth longleaf pine was lost since the 1700s. So the main culprit here was the timber industry, also the turpentine industry. Longleaf pine was a very valuable commodity when European settlers were taking over the eastern United States. Another thing that happened during that time is habitat degradation through fire suppression. So I mentioned before that the longleaf pine is a fire-maintained habitat, so we would expect fires to burn through that area on a regular basis. But once, those European settlers started moving into those areas, understandably, they didn't want fire where they lived, so they did what they could to suppress that fire. But after decades of fire suppression, that remaining habitat degraded to the point where it was not suitable for the RCWs anymore. So around the mid-1900s, people realized that these birds were disappearing and started to do something about it. So in 1970, the bird was listed as endangered, and then 3 years later, the Endangered Species Act was passed, and the bird received federal protection through the ESA. And then in 1979, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service put in place the very first recovery plan for the RCW, which has since been revised. And basically, the recovery plan outlined the ecology and natural history of the species, and then also the management needs, the conservation needs, and the challenges associated with those, essentially what needed to be done to bring their numbers back up. So following the implementation of the recovery plan, there were several decades of very intensive monitoring and management for the species with the intention of bringing those populations back up and working towards recovery of the species. And it worked. So currently, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that there are about 7,800 family groups across the Southeast. So remember, those numbers dropped down to about 1,470. So definitely a huge population increase. Nowhere near what they were historically, but still a very significant population increase over the past several decades. And along that same vein, in breaking woodpecker news, just a few weeks ago, the Department of the Interior announced that they would be downlisting the red-cockaded woodpecker from endangered to threatened. So officially, the species is no longer on the endangered species list. So of course, this is good news because downlisting was essentially the goal of the recovery plan, to bring their numbers up to a point where they were deemed to be robust enough that the species was no longer considered endangered. On the other hand, some people are concerned that downlisting the species and removing some of those protections might put the remaining populations at risk, particularly on private lands. So basically, we still need to keep an eye on those populations. We need to keep monitoring them, keep managing that habitat, because the species is doing a lot better, but it's not yet fully recovered. So I mentioned that there were decades of intensive management and monitoring for the species. So now I want to talk about what exactly that entails. I won't be able to cover everything, but I do want to mention some of the key strategies that were implemented for bringing the species back from the brink. So I want to start with habitat management, and I'm going to be somewhat repeating myself here, but habitat management for RCWs can basically be boiled down into one word, and that is fire. I really can't emphasize this enough. Without fire, you do not have RCWs. So I mentioned that we have, these natural fires that used to burn through the habitat to maintain it in a suitable condition. And then we had decades of fire suppression that degraded that habitat, right? So what can we do to bring that habitat back to a suitable condition and then maintain it in a suitable condition? Well, we have to put fire back on the ground. So we do that through prescribed burning, also known as controlled burning. So just as the name suggests, this is intentionally setting fire to the landscape in a controlled fashion in order to mimic the impacts of those historic fires. So to do this, burn managers need to have a strong understanding of course, the species they're trying to manage for and the habitat they're trying to manage for. They also need to know what that habitat looked like historically, and they have to have an understanding of how fire behaves on the landscape in response to soil, vegetation, environmental conditions, and so forth. So putting all of that together, they have to decide how often to burn, what time of year to burn, how many acres to burn. There's a lot of things that go into it. So in the case of the RCWs, ideally you want to burn every 3 to 4 years. You could get away with burning a little less often, but 3 to 4 is kind of the ideal fire return interval to maintain that open habitat for the RCWs. So this beautiful landscape here, which is within an RCW territory, was made possible by prescribed burning. There's another beautiful landscape brought to you by prescribed burning. So here's a photo that shows a recently burned area on the left and a somewhat less recently burned area on the right. So as you can see, even though that area was burned, a lot of the vegetation is still there. The trees are still standing. Of course, these species in these fire-maintained habitats are fire-adapted. So most of them are not going to die when a fire burns through that area. If you burn frequently, the fire is not going to be very intense and it's not going to kill everything. So within a few months, that area on the left is pretty much going to look like the area on the right. So this is just a quick video I took during a prescribed burn that I participated in earlier this year. So this is some palmettos burning. You can hear some cars going by because this was done near a highway. So this is kind of just what it looks like when you're out there burning the landscape. Alrighty. Okay. So again, key takeaway there, you need fire for RCWs. So moving on to the monitoring. Again, I won't be able to go over everything, but I want to talk about some of the key strategies that are utilized when we're trying to keep track of RCW populations. So before I do that, I just want to go over a little bit of RCW terminology that I'll be using for the remainder of this talk just to make sure that we are all on the same page. So the first term here is cluster. So a cluster is basically a tree or a group of trees, specifically cavity trees, that are either being used by RCWs or have been used by them in the past or are available for use by RCWs. So a cluster could be one tree, it could be dozens of trees, there could be one bird using a cluster, there could be a family group at a cluster, or there could be no birds at a cluster. But basically the cluster is essentially our base unit that we use for measuring RCW populations. And there are a lot of different types of clusters, and the most important of those is a PBG. And no, it's not pied-billed grebe, it's potential breeding group. So a PBG is essentially a male and a female, adult male and female that are occupying the same cluster, as well as any helpers or fledglings that they might have. So potential breeding group is essentially synonymous with breeding pair or family group. And then, so PBG is how we measure our population size and viability. So when we report our populations to the public or to other RCW biologists, generally we report it in terms of the number of PBGs. And then we also have SBGs or solitary bird groups. Sometimes a single bird will occupy a cluster. So in a lot of populations, we want to keep track of all of those cavity trees and the clusters. And so we do that by marking the trees. And there's different types of marking that you can do, but the kind of universal way that we mark RCW trees is putting white paint on them. There's other things you can put on there, like flagging or what have you. You can put tags on them, but the white paint, kind of the same across the board. Any RCW population that you visit, if they are keeping track of their tree, they're going to be marked with white paint. And this helps not only us keep track of our trees, but it also helps folks who are burning on that landscape to be aware of those trees and to be able to protect them if they need to. And so as far as mapping clusters, this is a sample map that I made of one of the sites where I work, Three Lakes WMA. It's actually where I am right now, currently located right around there. So as you can see, each of our clusters is numbered. We also label them with the cluster type. And the map just kind of gives us an idea of how our population is doing, how it's spread out over the landscape. And then for each cluster, I've also made cluster tree maps. So again, we take GPS points of all of our RCW cavity trees, and we mark if they're active or inactive. We label the tree on there, or the nest tree on there. And these maps just help us when we're trying to navigate through a cluster. Just to give you an idea, at the sites that I monitor, total, we have about 1,400 RCW cavity trees that we have to keep track of. So it's a lot of trees. We don't always remember where all the trees are. So these maps help us when we're navigating through those clusters and doing different surveys. Speaking of which, one of the surveys that we do every February and March in our population here is our annual cavity tree update. So basically, we have to visit every one of our known RCW cavity trees and take down a bunch of data on this data sheet. We look at what the vegetation type is underneath the tree. We look at how much sap is on the tree. Is it active? Is it inactive? Are the birds using it? And then we also look at all the cavities on that tree. What type are they? What condition are they in? And if there are complete cavities, we will also look inside and see what's going on in there, figure out if those cavities are suitable for the RCWs to use. So we want to know how many suitable trees we have on the landscape. In addition to keeping track of the trees, we also often want to keep track of the individuals. And we do this through color banding. So basically, we put these colorful little bands on the legs of the birds in unique combinations, and this allows us to keep track of individuals. And this is great for figuring out the dynamics of family groups, also great for tracking birds after they disperse. And it's especially important if you're translocating birds to keep track of them after you translocate. And I will talk a little bit more about translocation shortly. But depending on your population, depending on what you're trying to do, you might have all of your birds banded, you may have a portion of your birds banded, or you may have none of your birds banded. Here at our sites, initially, we did have all of our birds banded, but we're starting to phase out banding at one of the sites just because we have so many birds that we don't really need to keep track of all of them anymore. So you can band birds as adults. You can catch them out of the cavity and band them, but it's easier to do this when they are in the nest as chicks. So when they're about 8 to 10 days old, if we want to band them, we're going to climb the tree. We're going to take the chicks out of the nest, and we're going to put those lovely color bands on them. We're also going to weigh them, maybe take some measurements. We'll also look for parasites on the birds. So for example, here on this bird and here on this bird, you can see those brown dots. So that's an indication that there's mites in the cavity. It's usually not detrimental, but we like to take note of that. And then we'll return the birds to the cavities. So this is just an easy way for us to put color bands on a lot of birds all at once. So speaking of the nests, nest monitoring is another important way that we keep track of RCW populations. Here at our sites in Central Florida, we do try to find every nest at every PBG, and we monitor it from the time the eggs are laid to the time the chicks fledge. And in between, we'll visit maybe every week, week and a half, kind of depends on what we're trying to do, but we'll make regular visits. We will look inside the cavity, see how the nest is doing. So how do we look inside those cavities to see what's going on? So the process of looking into a cavity, we call it peeping. And we have a special camera, this guy right here. This is actually 3D printed. So this is called a peeper cam, and it connects to this monitor right here. And so we will put that camera onto a telescoping pole and hoist it all the way up, stick it into the cavity, and then we can look on the monitor and see what's going on in there. And we can take photos, we can take videos, and that helps us to monitor those cavities. So I also mentioned that we will climb the trees to take the chicks out. We also climb for other reasons. But to do that, we use these Swedish climbing ladders. So they're narrow 10-foot long ladders. They stack on top of each other. And they have a brace that you can put up against the tree. And then there's a chain that wraps around to secure it to the tree. Then we'll use a belt and harness to climb the tree. So this is yours truly up in a tree in South Carolina, actually. This is not in Florida. So 7 years ago, I worked with RCWs in South Carolina. So you might hear me mention South Carolina a few more times during this talk. But it looks like I'm using 2 ladder sections in this photo. So I'm about 20 feet off the ground. All right, so back to nest monitoring. So one of the checks that we do during the nest monitoring is a sex check. So RCWs are interesting in that the chicks are actually sexually dimorphic in the nest. So starting age 18 days, the males will develop this red crown patch, whereas the females will generally retain a black crown, or they might have a little white patch on there. So from 18 days to 20 days old, we can peep that cavity and we can see how many males and how many females are in there. So for example, here we have 1 male, 1 female. At that point, we'll leave the nest alone until the chicks fledge. And once they do, we'll return to that cluster and we will do a fledge check. So we try to see how many chicks have fledged. We try to confirm the sexes, and then we will also confirm color bands if they happen to have any. So here we have an unbanded male fledgling, and then on the right, we have another unbanded male that's being fed by an adult. So the males, those male fledglings will retain that crown patch for a couple of months, and then eventually they will molt that and just get the little cockade that the adult males have. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about RCW cavities. So it takes the birds about 2 to 6 years to excavate a cavity, which is a long time. And it's not always easy to find a suitable tree in suitable habitat, right? Because they need those mature trees in good habitat. So the cavity trees are essentially a limiting factor for growing populations, because without a cavity, the bird has nowhere to roost, which means at night it's going to be open roosting, and that makes them vulnerable to predation by nocturnal predators like owls. It also means they have nowhere to nest, right? So that population is not going to grow. So availability of cavity trees is one of the biggest limiting factors for growing RCW populations. So I want to tell you guys a little story here. In 1989, Hurricane Hugo swept through the southeastern United States and caused a great deal of damage. One of the areas that was hit really hard was Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina. At the time, it contained the 2nd largest population of RCWs. Following Hurricane Hugo, they lost almost 90% of their cavity trees. Because one of the disadvantages of putting a cavity in a tree is that it weakens the tree. So when you have hurricane force winds that come through, a lot of times that tree will snap right at the cavity. So losing almost 90% of the cavity trees in the 2nd largest population is devastating. So of course, the RCW biologists were scrambling to figure out how to replace those cavities so that that population would not collapse. So it was because of that need for that limiting factor that they came up with the idea of artificial inserts. So this is essentially a complete cavity contained within a box. There's a PVC entrance, and then there's metal in the front to reinforce that box. And we install these by climbing up a tree using a tree climber. And then we'll use a chainsaw and basically carve out a rectangular hole in the tree, put some wood putty on there, stick it in, and you basically have a complete cavity in that tree. And instead of taking 2 to 6 years, it takes roughly 30 minutes, depending on how skilled you are. So you could install dozens of these in a day. So you can imagine that this was a huge deal for RCW management at the time, right? So this is what it looks like when they are installed in the tree. But this was a very, very big deal, because not only were they able to very quickly replace those cavity trees that were lost and provide that limiting factor for the birds to ensure that the population didn't collapse, but they could also create new cavities. And in fact, they could create new clusters. So we call these recruitment clusters. And basically what you do is you find a area of habitat where you have at least 4 nice mature trees, and you will install a minimum of 4 of these artificial inserts and just create a new cluster that's available for the birds to use. And these recruitment clusters, you could put them in an existing population and either wait for the birds to occupy it themselves, or you could move birds via translocation and use that to augment an existing population. But you can also install these recruitment clusters in an area from which RCWs have been extirpated, and then you can move birds there to reestablish a population, right? Because if you're trying to reestablish a population, but you move birds into an area with no cavities, the birds are going to be like, why did you bring me here? I had some nice cavities back home and then you brought me here and now I have nothing to use, right? So these inserts are just so instrumental in not only growing existing populations, but helping to reestablish populations in areas where those birds were extirpated. And the birds readily use them. They nest in them, they roost in them. And they don't discourage the birds from making their own cavities. I mean, we have cavity trees here at our sites where there'll be an insert installed and then there'll be 1 or 2 natural cavities the birds made themselves. So the idea is not to discourage them from making their own, but the idea is to help grow those populations to a point where they no longer need those boxes. And the downside, though, is that they do need to be maintained. As with everything else, RCWs are very picky about their cavities. They like them to be very nice and clean. So we have to clean out those inserts when they get dirty or when anything else is in them. So right now in the fall, much of what I'm doing is actually insert maintenance. And then if those inserts get old or if they get damaged, they also need to be replaced. So definitely not a permanent solution, but a very, very important way of providing, again, that limiting resource of cavities so that the birds can grow their population to a point where they no longer need those inserts. All right, so I mentioned translocations a couple of times. I want to expand on that here. So RCWs are a non-migratory sedentary species. They don't really move around too much. Even when they're dispersing, generally, they will not move further than maybe a couple of territories away. I mean, there was one bird that ended up in Chicago, but that's more of an anomaly. Generally, they'll move a couple of territories away from their natal cluster, not going to move that far. So this means that they are especially sensitive to habitat fragmentation, right? Because when you isolate populations from each other and those birds are not flying very far, there's not going to be an exchange of birds. There's not going to be that exchange of genetic material. You're going to have inbreeding depression. Those populations are going to blink out. So translocations are a way of helping facilitate that movement for the birds across distances that are too great for them to cover, or just, mixing things up and increasing that genetic diversity. So when we do translocations, we always move fledglings. We never move adults that are already established at a cluster. Since the fledglings will often disperse anyway, it's essentially like assisted dispersal. And sometimes we will move individual birds. Sometimes we will move them in pairs. So if we're moving individual birds, it's usually we're doing some matchmaking. We have a single bird here, we got a single bird there. We want to pair them up, see if they get along. If we're moving birds in pairs, we'll generally take an unrelated male and female from the same population, move them to a new location, and then release them together, hope that they like each other, and hope that they become a breeding pair. And translocations can be done within the same population or metapopulation. We've done that here at our sites. They can also be done across populations. So, for example, when I worked in South Carolina, we did translocations from Georgia to South Carolina. We did translocations from South Carolina to Virginia. We also did translocations among sites within South Carolina. So really there's, you can just move birds across state lines, within state lines, whatever you need to do. And again, with using those recruitment clusters, you can use translocations to augment existing populations or to reestablish birds in areas from which they've been extirpated. So to do this, we have to capture the birds. So we wait until they roost in their cavities. Then we'll use a net and a pole like the one in this photo, and we'll wait for the birds to fly into the net. And then we will transfer them to this little box and take them to their new home and release them. Of course, safety first. We got to make sure they're buckled in. So this is where the color banding really comes in handy, because after we translocate them, we usually want to keep track of those birds, see how they're doing, see if pairing them up works, if they've established themselves in that area. And so having those color bands on the birds helps us keep track of them after the translocation. All right, so now that I've talked about all that monitoring and management, I want to just kind of show you guys where I am and what I do here. So as you can see on this map, we're here in Central Florida in Osceola County. So I am actually in charge of monitoring birds on 3 state-owned properties. So 3 Lakes Wildlife Management Area, Triple N Ranch Wildlife Management Area, and Bull Creek Wildlife Management Area. So again, I am currently in my office right around here at 3 Lakes. So these 3 properties, as well as some private lands in the area, together form the 3 Lakes metapopulation. So it's essentially one population that comprises several smaller populations that are close enough to each other that the birds can move among them. So here again is that cluster map for 3 Lakes WMA. As you can see, we have 76 total clusters, of which 54 are PBGs. So according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, you want to have at least 40 PBGs for your population to be considered viable. So we are well above that point. We used to translocate birds to this population, but we're not doing that anymore since we are well above that level of viability. And as you can see, we do still have some recruitment clusters here just to give the birds some areas to move into. So this population is growing, albeit slowly, but it's doing pretty well. Then here's a map of the clusters at Triple N and Bull Creek. These are adjoining properties, so we treat them as one population. So this area here, we have 30 PBGs. So we are below that threshold of 40. So we are still doing translocations to Triple N Bull Creek in hopes of growing that population up to 40. And again, you can see we have all these recruitment clusters here available for the birds to use. All right, so we've established that RCWs were imperiled. We established that we've done all this management, all this monitoring. So I want to talk a little bit about why are we doing all of this? Why do RCWs matter? Why do we care? Now, I'm sure all of you, like myself, are bird lovers, bird enthusiasts. You know, we love birds for their own sake. They have intrinsic value, and we think that they should exist as they are supposed to exist. But when we have to pour a lot of money and time and other resources into managing for the species and monitoring the species, when we have to set aside land for them, particularly land that perhaps certain entities would want to use for other purposes, we do need to provide a justification for what we're doing. So I want to talk about ecologically why RCWs are so important. And there's really two big things that I want to talk about here. So the first is that RCWs are an umbrella species. So because RCWs have these specific habitat requirements, because they require all of this monitoring and management, because they need a lot of space. I didn't really talk about this, but RCW territories generally range from 100 to 400 acres. So if you have a large viable population, you need a lot of space. And they also share their habitat with a lot of other species. So that means when you are managing for RCWs, when you're setting aside land for them, when you're conserving them, you are also managing for and conserving so many other species. So to illustrate this point, and also because I want to share a bunch of photos with you guys, I want to show you some of the species that I personally have encountered in RCW habitat. This is mainly going to be here in the Mesic Flatwoods in Central Florida, but also a little bit in South Carolina. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just a very, very small fraction of the many species that share habitat with RCWs and that benefit from the management that we do for them. But just want to show you guys who else is benefiting from what we do. So first of all, this is a Bachman sparrow. You guys might recognize this guy if you've ever been down south. So this is actually an important species because they are an indicator species. Having them in your habitat means your habitat is in good condition. So you want Bachman sparrows in your habitat. And they like frequently burned areas, recently burned areas. So not surprising that we see them quite a bit in the RCW habitat. We have a lot of them here. I mean, we can hear them singing outside the office on a daily basis. This is a Bachman sparrow nest that I found in one of our RCW clusters. Great horned owls, we all know them, we all love them. These cuties were in a nest that we had on property earlier this year. And as you can see, the nest is in a longleaf pine. Northern bobwhite, this is a big one. Bobwhites are not only an imperiled species, but they're also a game bird. So there's a lot of private lands and some private and some public lands here in the South where they do management specifically for the bobwhite. So there is quite a bit of overlap in the habitat needs of bobwhites and RCWs. It's not 100%, but there's a lot of overlap. So what that means is if you're managing for RCWs, you're going to have bobwhite even if you're not trying for them. And the opposite is true. If you're on a quail plantation and you're managing for bobwhite, there's a good chance you're going to have RCWs as well, even if you're not trying for them. So there's a lot of overlap in the management benefits there as well for these two species. This is a yellow-crowned night heron. Just one of many wading birds that we have in the flatwoods. We do have ponds, we have wet areas in the flatwoods, so it's not uncommon to see wading birds out there. Although this was my first time seeing this particular species in the flatwoods. I encountered this guy very early one morning when I was on my way to a northern bobwhite survey. I caught him in my headlights and decided to take a photo. Turkeys, another important game bird that we find in the flatwoods. This is a common nighthawk sitting on a longleaf pine. We get these guys in the summertime. They are quite common out here. It's actually really cool. In the mornings and in the evenings, we'll see them flying through the RCW clusters. They'll land on the trees. There's often quite a few of them. This is actually a common nighthawk nest that I found in the middle of one of our RCW clusters as well. So this is kind of neat. This is a photo I took this morning. This is a cluster that we have just down the road from our office. As you can see, this is an RCW tree. It's marked with white paint. This is actively being used as a roost tree by one of our RCWs. But also at the top, we have a bald eagle nest. So, and you can't see it in this photo, but there's actually an eagle sitting on the nest. Here in Central Florida, their breeding season is underway, so they're already starting to pair up and get in their nests. But yeah, so this is a great example of a longleaf pine that is serving double duty, supporting not one but two imperiled species, and another great example of how management for the RCWs is benefiting other imperiled species as well. This is a cottonmouth or water moccasin. Some of you may be familiar with this guy. This is a venomous snake. We do find these occasionally in the wetter areas in the flatwoods. I encountered this guy on my way to an RCW cluster. This is a garter snake, another very cool species. Pygmy rattlesnake, rough green snake. We have a lot of snakes out here, which I love because I love snakes. This is a ribbon snake. This is a pine woods tree frog, very common out in the flatwoods, as the name suggests. This is a pine woods tree frog sitting on an RCW tree. As you can see, it's pretty well camouflaged on the bark there. This is a fun one. This is an island glass lizard, one of two species of glass lizard that we have here. We also have eastern glass. As you guys know, these guys they kind of look like snakes. They're not snakes. Two ways to tell. They have an ear hole and they also have eyelids. Snakes don't have those two things. Just fun facts. All right, this is an eastern diamondback rattlesnake. I photographed this guy in one of our RCW clusters. Here's another one that we saw outside our house here on property. Black racer, the one on the right is eating a frog. Like I said, we do have a lot of snakes out here. Alrighty, this is a very important one. This is a gopher tortoise. If any of you have visited the South or are familiar with the wildlife in the South, you've probably heard of gopher tortoises. They are a keystone species, very, very important. They have a huge impact on their ecosystem, and they are what we call ecosystem engineers. So they physically alter their environment. And specifically, the gopher tortoise, as their name suggests, they burrow in the ground. They create these long burrows, and hundreds of other species will use those burrows, up to and including birds like burrowing owls. So gopher tortoises are very, very important to have, and they do share habitat with RCWs and benefit from the management that we do. I have to include some plants in here for the plant folks. This beautiful flower is a pine lily. This is another fire-dependent species that we have out here. We're kind of on the tail end of wildflower season here in Central Florida, but these guys were blooming lately, and I always love seeing them. Pitcher plants, this is another fun one. These are carnivorous plants. I'm sure you guys are familiar with them. From left to right, we have yellow pitcher plant, we have hooded pitcher plant, and purple pitcher plant. So this hooded, we have quite a few of the hoodeds here in Central Florida, but the yellow and the purple I photographed in South Carolina. Here's another carnivorous plant that I photographed in South Carolina. This is a Venus flytrap. Not a species I was expecting to see, but it's pretty cool. This was in the pine habitat. Here's a wide shot where you can see the flowers coming off those Venus flytraps there. Pretty cool. Bobcat, photographed this guy just down the road here, also the species that we see out in the flatwoods. This is a southern fox squirrel. It's a subspecies of eastern fox. If you've ever seen them, you know they are gigantic, practically skunk-sized, very, very large squirrel. Have to show a little bit of appreciation for the invertebrates as well. So all of these guys were photographed on RCW trees. From left to right, we have southern two-striped walking stick, we have a regal jumping spider, and we have Florida ivory millipede. There's another invertebrate here on this RCW tree, but it is well camouflaged. There's another regal jumping spider there. That's what they look like. This is one of my favorites. This is a species of bark scorpion known as the Hence striped scorpion. Very common on the longleaf pines. We usually see them kind of tucked away underneath the bark. And one time I actually saw one with babies on its back, so that was pretty cool. All right, so hopefully those photos kind of helped illustrate the point here. Again, that was just one tiny sample of the vast variety of species that share the habitat with RCWs and that benefit from the management that we do for the RCWs. But there is one other important reason that RCWs matter. So RCWs, like the gopher tortoises, are ecosystem engineers. Again, they do alter their physical habitat. And the way they do this is through primary cavity excavation, right? They create these cavities and then other species will use those cavities. Some of those species can make their own cavities, but they just choose not to. But there are a lot of species that are not able to make their own cavities. So they rely on the cavities that the RCWs make. Again, that is a limiting resource for them as well, for nesting, for roosting, for protection, what have you. So I hope you guys are ready for some more photos because I'm about to show you a lot more photos of animals that use RCW cavities. So most of these were taken here in Florida. Also, again, there's going to be a few from South Carolina and then a few from another site that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So these are ones that we would have photographed with those peeper cameras that I showed you earlier. So big one, red-bellied woodpecker. This is a species that is able to excavate its own cavity, but sometimes they don't want to. So they will take over RCW cavities. They will actually take over active RCW cavities and nest cavities. They've been known to depredate RCW nests and take over their cavities. So there is active competition with the RCWs. This is a bluebird nest. A lot of you will probably recognize this. Bluebirds will use RCW cavities. Occasionally they'll use the natural cavities, but they seem to prefer the boxes. Not a big surprise there. The boxes are pretty similar to the bluebird boxes that they use. Eastern screech owl, love these guys. You can see the one on the right is actually incubating an egg here. I love how they always look so offended when we peep their cavities, but they will also use the RCW cavities. So this photo actually was not taken at our sites here. This was taken at a site about 22 miles southwest of here as the RCW flies. Not that they would fly that far. This was taken at a site called Avon Park Air Force Base. I visited this site last week and the RCW biologist there was nice enough to lend me some of his photos. So this is actually a great crested flycatcher nest. As some of you might know, they like putting feathers and even snake sheds in their nests. They have, those eggs are kind of an interesting color. Oh, let me back it up here. So some other bird species that will use RCW cavities for which I don't have photos. Pileated woodpeckers will use them, northern flicker, red-headed woodpeckers, tufted titmice, chickadees, white-breasted nuthatch, American kestrels will use them. Wood ducks will use them. And one that I only found out about recently, hooded mergansers will use them, which is pretty cool, I think. Now, as I'm saying this, you might be asking yourself, how the heck does a hooded merganser fit into an RCW cavity? Well, initially they don't. As with everything else, RCWs are very picky about their cavities. They like them to be a particular size. So usually their cavities are not going to be larger than about 1 3/4 of an inch in diameter at the entrance. But what happens is other birds like pileated woodpeckers will go in and enlarge those cavities at the entrance and also inside. Once that happens, the RCWs are not going to want to use those cavities anymore, but those cavities will become suitable for larger species. So that's where the screech owls will come in, the kestrels will come in, the wood ducks, the hooded mergansers. So this is kind of like a secondary ecosystem engineering that happens. Moving on to some mammals. These are southern flying squirrels. This photo was taken here in Florida. These photos were taken in South Carolina. So we had maybe 2 or 3 cavities in all of our sites that had flying squirrels. Not really an issue here, but in South Carolina, it was a very different story. We had lots and lots of flying squirrels, and they do actively compete with the RCWs. They will depredate the adults. They will predate on the nests. So we do have some issues with predation, but they are cute. I like them. This is actually kind of interesting that we found this this past season. I believe this is a flying squirrel skeleton in an RCW cavity. Okay, this one is really cool. I like this. So bats are known to roost in RCW cavities. We know this. But this is a really cool instance of a bat roosting in a cavity. So this photo was given to me again by the biologist from Avon Park Air Force Base. As you can see, it was taken about 10 years ago. He told me that he peeped this cavity. He saw there was a bat in there. He sent the photo off to some bat specialists, and they looked at it and determined that it was a Florida bonneted bat, which is a critically endangered species. It is the rarest bird in America. The rarest bat species that we have in America. So a very big deal to find them roosting in those RCW cavities. And so because of this photo, they actually came in and looked around for other roost trees, and they found several more trees that had bonneted bats in them. And so now they have a bonneted bat monitoring program at Avon Park. So another example of other imperiled, critically endangered species benefiting. You know, if we didn't have that RCW habitat, if they weren't on the landscape making those cavities, we wouldn't have found these bonneted bats in the territory. Moving on to some herps. This is a barking tree frog. Here's another frog at an entrance of a cavity. This was taken in South Carolina. Not sure what species that is, though. Here's a green anole checking out an RCW cavity. This is a southeastern five-line skink, I believe. This is what they look like when they're out of the cavity. Corn snakes. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of corn snakes. This is probably the second most common species that we find in the RCW cavities. There's a lot of them out there. I did mention that snakes will predate the nests of RCWs. So in the summertime, the corn snakes are going to try to climb those trees and get into the nests. But most of these photos were taken during our cavity tree update in the winter and early spring. So a lot of times it seems that the snakes will go into the cavities just kind of looking for a place to shed. You can see several of these corn snakes are exhibiting signs that they're about to shed. So their eyes are kind of milky blue. Their skin is kind of shiny. So I guess the cavity are just kind of they're warm, they're dark, they're safe, and they go in there to shed. And sometimes we'll see a snake there, and then we'll come back a week later. There'll be a nice long snake shed outside the tree, and the snake will be gone. Sometimes we don't even need to peep the cavity to know that there's a corn snake in there, as we'll just see them outside the cavity. Sometimes they will squeeze into places we don't even think they should be able to squeeze into. So this is a cavity that closed up, again, because they make cavities in live pine trees. You know, the tree is still alive. So sometimes if they're not maintaining those cavities, they will close up. We call that occlusion. So this is a cavity that is almost totally occluded, and yet there is a corn snake hanging out in there. So I guess they take what they can get. All right, this is an eastern rat snake. I believe this was the only one we found in a cavity when we were doing our cavity tree update, but we did have another interesting encounter with a rat snake sort of outside of working hours. One of my coworkers about a year ago messaged me and he said, "You got to come see this." He lives down the road. So I went down to check it out, and this is what we saw. So this is a rat snake that is constricting a red-bellied woodpecker from inside an inactive RCW box, an artificial insert. So this is actually inside a dead tree. So the RCWs are not using it anymore. But presumably the rat snake was just hanging out in the cavity. The red-bellied decided to investigate the cavity, and the rat snake decided to constrict the bird. Eventually, they were like this for about half an hour. Eventually, the bird did actually get away, but just an interesting example of cavity use in action. This is a fun one. This is another one from Avon Park. As you can see, this is a corn snake that's getting ready to shed, but if you look to the left of the corn snake right there, that is a scarlet king snake right there. So that is pretty cool. I've never seen one of those in a cavity or otherwise. Wood roaches. So this is the species that we encounter most often in the cavities. These are wood roaches. I think I've maybe seen them once in a natural cavity. Pretty much every other time they're in the boxes. I don't know what it is about the boxes that they like, but they are always in the artificial inserts. Sometimes we call them boxes. So I did mention that a lot of what I'm doing right now is the insert maintenance, cleaning out the cavities to make sure that they're nice and clean for the RCWs. So a lot of what I'm doing is vacuuming up these roaches and moving them elsewhere, because if the cavity is full of roaches, the RCWs are not going to want to use that cavity. So I've been doing a lot of cleaning out of wood roaches, but other species don't seem to mind them. We will often see other species in there with the roaches sharing the cavities. So for example, these are nests of mud dauber wasps, and there's also roaches in there. Here's a paper wasp sharing a cavity with a roach. Here's some barking tree frogs sharing a cavity with some roaches, and corn snakes sharing cavities with roaches. So again, if they're just looking for a place to shed, they don't seem to care that there are roaches in there. And finally, bees. Bees will also use RCW cavities. Usually they're nice enough to swarm the outside of the cavity so we know there are bees and we don't bother peeping. Sometimes we don't find out that there are bees until we actually stick the camera in there, and then we pull the camera out and suddenly there are bees pouring out of the cavity. Always interesting. Thankfully, they usually attack the camera and not us. But yeah, always interesting to find out that there are bees in there. All right. So I've hopefully demonstrated to you guys why RCWs are so neat, why they're so unique biologically, and why they are so important to have in the ecosystem. Again, I'm calling them icons of the Southeast. I think that they're an iconic species, not only because of their biology, but also because they're such a great example of the resilience of a species, you know, the ability of a species to bounce back after nearly facing extinction. You know, you make that habitat available for them, they boost their numbers. So, and also I'm biased. I work with them. I think they're a really neat species, but hopefully with this presentation, I was able to give you guys an appreciation for the species and show you why they are so iconic. So with that, I will take questions. I put my contact information down there. So if any of you are ever in Central Florida and you'd like to see an RCW, I would be happy to show you guys around our properties and show you those birds.
Maybe we'll have a field trip down there, huh?
You're welcome anytime.
This was really, really tremendous. Very, very interesting. Let me read some of the questions in the chat. Let's see. First question was, is there a difference in the sex ratio of the fledglings or survival of the males versus females that leads to the female fledglings being more likely to disperse in their SY? And I'm sorry, I don't know what SY is.
Oh, second year. They usually disperse in their hatch year, but so as far as sex ratios, that will vary depending on populations. Some populations may have more males, some may have more females. The dispersal rates has more to do with the behavior of the birds. So basically, the breeding male is going to stay in his territory pretty much until he dies. Whereas the breeding females will sometimes, about 10% of them in between breeding seasons will just naturally disperse and go off somewhere else. And this is believed to be a strategy to avoid inbreeding. If they do have male helpers, if that breeding male dies, the breeding female is going to leave so that she's not mating with her offspring. And so if the female dies, or if the female decides to leave and disperse in between breeding seasons, that male is going to be looking for a female to fill that breeding vacancy. So those hatchier females that disperse and go off are going to be flying around and looking for an available male. And so the females dispersing kind of has to do with that paradigm where the breeding females are sometimes just going to leave. And so there's a breeding vacancy, and then you need those floater females, those hatchier females that are dispersing to then come in and fill those breeding vacancies. So hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, so what basically short answer is that the difference in the dispersal behavior has more to do with the behavior of the birds themselves and the breeding strategy than it necessarily has to do with the sex ratios of the nestlings.
Okay, thank you. We have some questions about the artificial inserts. 3 questions. Do they need to be artificially sapped? Have you compared reproductive success and predation in artificial versus natural cavities? And who maintains the natural cavities?
Okay. So as far as the sapping of the cavities, so one of the things we do after we install the artificial cavities is we'll use a bark scraper to scrape bark off the tree, because this is something the birds would naturally do. And then we might also use a hammer to hammer in a few sap wells. So we do try to make the tree look a little more enticing for the birds. Some people will actually use white paint to mimic the appearance of sap to catch the bird's attention. But then once the birds take over that artificial insert, they are going to sap up that tree themselves anyway. And then the second part of that was the breeding success. That is a very good question. I actually don't know if there is a difference. I would think that there wouldn't be, just because the cavity is roughly the same size and, has the same dimensions and everything. And when you include it in that habitat, everything else is going to be the same. The breeding success is more likely to be influenced by the behavior of the birds and food availability and things like that. But honestly, I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know if there is a difference. The third question of who maintains the natural cavities, we don't actually do anything with the natural cavities. We let the birds maintain them themselves. So we really only maintain the artificial cavities. So we do the cleaning, we do the replacements, or in some cases we'll just retire them. But yeah, the natural cavities, we don't do anything with that.
Okay. Julie commented that she has had the good luck to have seen the RCWs in the Pensacola, Florida area. It was at a tree farm, and she saw the artificial inserts in the trees. And do you know if the people who own the tree farms allow controlled burns?
At Pensacola, I don't know specifically, but if they do have RCWs on the landscape, then they probably are burning, because if they weren't, they wouldn't have the habitat for the RCWs. Thankfully, prescribed burning is pretty widely accepted and implemented in the Southeast, also even on private lands. It's very much in the culture. So a lot of people do burn, not only for RCWs, they do burning for quail, for various other things. So So it is actually pretty accepted in the Southeast.
Okay. You have a lot of good comments here. Renee said, dream job, so interesting. Mike says, great presentation. Thank you. Renee
Thank you.
says, fantastic talk, Roxy. Thank you for sharing. Frank says, thank you. Tina says, very informative. Thank you. Dallas says,
Appreciate it.
fascinating. Thanks a million. Katie says, thanks, Roxy. And then Lizzie says, or questions, are you worried that RCWs being downgraded to threatened will significantly impact their conservation efforts to the point that the populations will drop? Or do you think the changes will be minimal?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there is some concern that downlisting and removing some of the protection might impact birds. It will probably impact them more on private lands because on public lands, they are still going to be protected. Here in Florida, it's not as much of an issue because we don't have as many RCWs on private lands, but in the Carolinas, for example, they do have they have more RCWs on private lands. But I think because we are aware of those populations and we are monitoring them, we can, like I said, we can kind of keep an eye on those. So for the moment, they should be okay as long as they continue that management. Those populations should be all right. But yeah, we are going to keep a close eye on them and hope that downlisting is not going to negatively affect them. But overall, they should be all right.
A question from Renee. What would necessitate the need to clean the artificial inserts when the natural ones don't need to be cleaned? She said, I do understand the general maintenance of them otherwise. And thank you for a great talk.
So that's a good question. I think that there's something about the boxes that they seem to be, so for example, the wood roaches, right? I mentioned that we practically never get wood roaches in the natural cavities. They seem to practically only be in the boxes. The corn snakes most often will be in the boxes. Some species just seem to prefer them. I don't know if there's a difference, like maybe just a tiny difference in the internal conditions of the boxes versus the cavities. So there seems to be more of a need to clean those out. But I think it's also just because this is a resource that we are providing for them. Again, trying to fill the need for that limiting resource that we try to keep the boxes in good condition. But it's, yeah, when with the natural cavities, it's also just a little bit more difficult in terms of access with the way the cavities are, the sap and everything like that. But yeah, it seems like there just are more things that like to make homes in boxes that we are able to clean out versus in the natural cavities, if that makes sense. And so there's more of a need to keep them clean. So specifically with those wood roaches and other species that will use them, like bluebirds, a lot of what we do is removing old bluebird nests from those boxes and things like that. It's just the maintenance is just part of keeping. So also the natural cavities being in the trees, if other species are using them, it's not going to degrade the quality of the tree. Whereas this box, because it's man-made, I mean, it's made from pine, it's made from southern yellow pine, but if it's being used by other species over time, that's also going to degrade the quality of the box itself. So cleaning it is going to help prolong the life of that box, which is not something we really need to do with a natural cavity because it's just the tree, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, thanks for holding that box up. That was nice to get a perspective on the size.
Yes, this is what it looks like. Yeah, so this is pine, and then the top is made from cedar. They used to make the whole thing out of cedar, but they determined that the pine was a better material.
Are those available on the market if anybody wanted to buy something like that?
Yeah, we get them. There's a person that makes them for us. I forget where they're based out of, but yeah, we don't make them on site. There's a few specific folks that make them widely for the RCW community.
Okay. All right. We have some more questions here too. What are the social perspectives of RCWs? Is there anything like spotted, or is it anything like spotted owls, which are so disliked by developers, etc.?
Definitely, yeah. Anything that gets in the way of development is going to be unpopular with some entities. There are also some private landowners that are not always thrilled to find that they have RCWs on their land because it means that they have to manage the land a certain way. So we do have something called Safe Harbor, which is a program that is run, I forget if it's federal, but basically it's sort of making an agreement with landowners that if however many RCWs are on their property at a given time, that's going to be the baseline. Basically, they just need to maintain that baseline. They're not expected to increase the number of RCWs, but as long as they maintain that baseline, they kind of will allow for a little bit more flexible use of that land, if that makes sense. So rather than just requiring them to preserve all of it and not do any harvesting or anything like that, they will allow more flexible use of the land in exchange for maintaining that baseline. So that's one way of kind of coming to a compromise with private landowners that have RCWs on their property.
Yeah, that makes sense. You'd get a lot more cooperation that way, I would think. Yeah. Okay, another comment. Roxy, thank you for preparing and presenting such an excellent talk. So much fantastic information. And I agree, it was excellent. So
Thank you.
yeah, now that's all I see in the chat, but anybody who still has a question, feel free to open up your audio and or video if you want and ask Roxy any further questions. Okay, here comes Mom.
Well, I don't know. If we have time, I would like to know if Roxy thinks this is her favorite species that she ever worked with, or some other bird takes that place.
Oh, and you can tell us how to pronounce the Hawaiian bird's name.
Yeah,
Oh, Hawaiian bird. Oh, so that's pronounced a kohe kohe. It's a crested honey creeper. It's named after the sound it makes. That was the first species that I ever worked with, actually, as an ornithologist. That was pretty cool. Yeah, I don't know if I have a favorite. They're all pretty great. RCWs are definitely one of my favorites. I mean, I've worked with them twice now, so I guess I must like them.
Or the other way around.
how many RCW researchers are there in Florida, would you say?
Oh, geez. I actually don't know. Probably at least several dozen, maybe more.
All right.
I mean, yeah, so for example, in some cases, there's going to be properties that have their own RCW biologist. In some cases, there's going to be, there are private contractors that will do work on private lands, for example, people who work for federal, for state, all kinds of things. So I don't actually know how many we have. Once a year, we do have an annual meeting, Southern Range Translocation Cooperative meeting, where RCW folks from all over the Southeast will meet. And I mean, there's probably at least a couple hundred folks that turn up for that in person or virtually. And again, that's going to be across all different agencies, private, public. But yeah, there's got to be at least a few dozen of us across the state, because Florida has quite a few RCWs, a lot of very large populations as well, especially in the Panhandle. So there's a lot of us out there.
That's good to know. That's good to know. Looks like there's another question in the chat here. Oh dear. Okay. Oh, do you, I would assume she means researchers, do anything to protect the nest from predators?
Yes, actually. In fact, I wonder if I could, give me 1 second here. Yes, so we will basically wrap foil around the base of the tree. We call that a SNED, or a snake exclusion device. Sometimes you can also use aluminum flashing, but basically it's just to reduce the likelihood of the snakes climbing up into the tree and getting to the cavity. I do have a photo here that I can share. Let me just find that real quick and I'll just share it in a second. Oh, there we go. All right. Sorry, stand by. All righty. So this is what that looks like. So we try to do about a 4-foot coverage with the foil, and it's just going to make that surface smooth. We try to make sure that there's no holes that they could slither through. Again, just to decrease the chances that the snake is going to climb up, because they're good at it. I mean, even with the sap, even with the SNED, some of the snakes will still get through, but just to decrease the chances that they will get up into that cavity.
You know, my husband has tried to protect, for instance, our bird feeders and a bird nest with aluminum flashing, but that looks like it would be a much tighter fit. It would be harder for something to get upwards beyond it. In your experience, do you find that the foil works better than aluminum flashing?
I do not have those data. I know we used aluminum flashing when I was in South Carolina. Here we use foil. I don't know. I would think if it's installed properly, the aluminum flashing is probably better because it's stiff and it's completely smooth, whereas the foil does somewhat take on the ridges of the bark because it's thinner. So as long as you make sure that there's no gapping underneath that the snakes can get through, the aluminum flashing is probably going to be more effective as long as you have it wide enough.
Okay. All right. You know, and personally, I was interested in those. Let's see, the peeper camera, or the camera peeper. Are those available or easily found online? I think they'd be so handy to have.
Yeah, so let me bring one up on camera actually. So this is from a company called IBWO, IBWO, that's Ivory-billed woodpecker. The person who makes these, I think, may have used them in their attempt to find ivory-billed woodpeckers. But these are so originally these used to be quite expensive, but then they started 3D printing them. So there's ibwo.org if you can see that.
Okay.
So yeah, they 3D print these cameras. They've got like a little switch, little antenna on there. We've got like a little cap that we put on there to protect the antenna, but they connect to that monitor. And yeah, super convenient for looking into the cavities.
Hmm.
And yeah, so we get those online. They're available for all kinds of projects. They're used for kestrel nest monitoring, nest box monitoring as well, things like that.
Okay. All right. All right. That might be it for the chat. Oh, whoop, let me check. Another thing just came up here. Thank you. Yeah, this is a one more thing from Julie. Thank you, Roxy. She really enjoyed your presentation. Yeah.
I appreciate it.
This was wonderful. Do you do this presentation a lot?
No, this was my first time doing this particular presentation.
It was really well put together. Yeah.
Thank you. I enjoyed putting it together. I actually learned some things about the RCWs in the process of researching for this presentation. So it was good for me too.
Okay. Well, are there any more comments, questions?
Well, nobody asked this, but since I have the stuff here, would you like me to demonstrate how we get the chicks out of the cavities?
Oh, I would like that. Yeah.
So yeah, the cavities are too small for us to just like stick our hands in there and get the chicks out. So we have a very complicated technical method of getting them out. So I'm going to demonstrate that for you guys. So the equipment that we use, rubber tubing. You can see that. Very, very technical, very complicated. So there's fishing line attached to that rubber tubing. So we kind of tie it on the end there, and when we feed the fish line through the tube to the end here, it's tied. So when I pull this end, the tubing will close. So basically, we have created a lasso that we can use to get the birds out. So imagine, if you will, I'm 20 feet up a tree. There's a lot of noise coming from inside this cavity. I get my lasso ready, and then I cover the hole with my hand so it blocks the light, and the birds think that the parents are coming to feed them. So they raise their head and they raise their body, which is what we want. Then I'm going to take this guy, stick it in there. Not quite that rough, but I'm going to stick it in there. And then once it's caught on the metal. There we go. Put that in there, and then I'm going to pull this end to tighten. Once I feel resistance, then I'm going to carefully pull it out, and hopefully there will be a chick attached to that end. And then I'll put the chicks into like a little pouch that I have and climb down and band them. And then we bring them back up and just kind of pop them back into the cavities. So yep.
Well, very interesting. Let's see. I've got another question or comment here.
Oh, thank you, Milt.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to see RCWs with Roxy in the field, so I can speak to her love and dedication to these awesome birds. Thank you for the presentation. Wow.
You're welcome.
They are lucky to have you.
Thank you. I enjoy it here. There's always, I mean, you saw from the photos, there's always something new to see out here. There's so much wildlife. I really enjoy it. In the process of working with RCWs, you get to see so many cool things. So
No,
you never know what's going to be out there.
no, you ended up in the right spot. That's
Hey, Roxy, quick question.
Yes.
Oh, I don't know if anyone talked about it. You mentioned it, the ivory bills. Do you think something like this would have worked back then if we were smart enough to do this, or was it been harder because they're such large birds? They need like bigger old growth trees, to be able to survive.
To do which aspect of the RCW monitoring?
Like to do the nest cavities, to preserve their habitat, because I think a lot of them disappeared probably because of hunting, but mainly because of logging, right?
Oh, you mean the artificial cavities?
Well, I'm talking about, yeah, with the ivory bills, like would something like this have maybe helped, or is it like a completely different approach that you would have to take?
I guess it really depends on the biology of the ivory bills. Again, the reason, for example, the artificial cavities work with the RCWs is because the cavities are the limiting factor for growing their populations. And a lot of the RCW's biology is actually related to the habitat and the limiting factor of those cavities, the cooperative breeding and so forth. So I don't know if it's the same for the ivory bills, if they rely on the cavities as much, or if there's other, if cavities are a limiting factor for them as well, then maybe it would have worked. Would have been a little more difficult though, because if I remember correctly, they are in hardwoods. And as the name suggests, that is a lot harder to dig a hole in a hardwood and put a box in there as compared to a pine that has softwood. But possibly yes. If they were as reliant on cavities, and if that was as much of a limiting factor for them as it is for the RCWs, then possibly that might have helped. Yeah.
Okay. Thank
Would have
you.
been a lot trickier though, because they're going to be in those flooded bottomland hardwoods, right? So it's going to be, might need a canoe to get up into those trees.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
Anything else from anybody? I guess not. Well, thank you very much again. I'm going to highly recommend on our social media, once I get this posted to our YouTube channel, that everybody should take the chance to listen and learn, because it was very interesting. So
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
we're okay. Well, thanks everybody for attending. Our next program will be the third Friday in January. We don't normally have programs in January, but this time we're going to. So announcements about the speaker and the topic will be on our website. If anybody here tonight does not get our announcements about our speakers, if you would like to be put on our email list, you can send me an email with your name, of course, in your email address, and just send it to president@prescoaudubon.org. Or if you forget and then you want to do it, just go to our website, and there's an info@prescoaudubon.org. You can send your request to be added to our mailing list there. All right. Thank you very much, Roxy. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.